A year earlier, if you had asked anyone who knew Joyce Mitchell whether she was successful, they would have laughed at the question. Success seemed too small a word to describe the life she had built. At just 28 years old, Joyce was living the kind of life many people spend decades chasing and never reach. She owned a thriving fashion company, lived in a luxurious mansion, traveled wherever she wanted, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the future belonged to her. People admired her. Competitors envied her. Young entrepreneurs studied her journey, hoping to duplicate it. On social media, every photograph appeared perfect. Every achievement looked effortless. Every milestone seemed to confirm that Joyce had somehow discovered a secret formula for success. Yet on a cold evening 1 year later, that same woman sat alone in a silent room staring at a stack of unpaid bills. The confidence that once defined her had disappeared. The smile that filled countless photographs had faded. And in her hands was an old Bible covered with years of dust. At that moment, Joyce was not thinking about success. She was not thinking about fame, recognition, or wealth. She was wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. She was wondering why the life she had worked so hard to build now felt as though it was slipping through her fingers. Most importantly, she was asking herself a question she had spent years avoiding. Had she spent so much time building her empire that she had forgotten the one who gave her the ability to build it in the first place? Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Joyce arrived at this moment, we have to go back several years. Long before the luxury cars, the designer clothing, and the impressive business deals, Joyce was simply a young woman with ambition. She grew up in a Christian home where faith was part of everyday life. She attended church regularly. She listened to Bible stories. She believed God had a purpose for her future. Family members often described her as determined, disciplined, and hardworking. Even at a young age, she dreamed of creating something meaningful. She wanted to build a business. She wanted financial freedom. She wanted to prove that with enough dedication, almost anything was possible. There was nothing wrong with those dreams. In fact, many of them would eventually come true. The problem was not success itself. The problem was what success slowly began to replace. As opportunities increased, Joyce became busier. As profits grew, her schedule became more demanding. One missed prayer became several. One skipped church service became a habit. The Bible that once sat open on her nightstand eventually remained untouched for weeks at a time. Then months. Eventually years. The change happened so gradually that she barely noticed it. Yet every step she took toward greater success seemed to place a little more distance between her and God. What made Joyce's story so remarkable was that outwardly, nothing appeared wrong. In fact, everything seemed right. Her company expanded faster than she expected. New clients arrived constantly. Investors expressed interest in her brand. Employees admired her leadership. Revenue increased year after year. Every achievement reinforced a belief that she was in complete control of her future. Friends praised her intelligence. Business magazines highlighted her accomplishments. Strangers looked at her life and assumed she must be blessed. Yet there was a subtle change taking place inside her heart. When people congratulated her success, she accepted every compliment as proof of her own abilities. When someone mentioned God's blessings, she smiled politely but rarely gave it much thought. Deep down, Joyce had started believing that everything she possessed existed because of her effort alone. She no longer felt dependent on God. She felt dependent on herself. The more she succeeded, the more confident she became. The more confident she became, the less she felt she needed guidance. And the less guidance she sought, the more she convinced herself that she alone was responsible for the life she had created. It was a belief that seemed harmless at first. After all, many successful people think the same way. But within a short period of time, a series of events would challenge everything Joyce believed about success, security, and control. The first warning would arrive unexpectedly. And when it did, she would discover that some lessons can only be learned when the things we trust most begin to disappear. To understand how Joyce ended up sitting alone in that mansion, clutching a dusty Bible while her world seemed to be collapsing around her, we first need to understand who she was before everything changed. Because stories like this rarely begin with a crisis. They begin with a series of choices, small decisions that appear harmless at first, but eventually lead somewhere completely unexpected. Looking back, many people would later ask the same questions. What caused the fall? Why did everything collapse? Was it simply bad luck? Was it the betrayal of someone she trusted? Or was there something much deeper taking place beneath the surface? And perhaps the most important question of all, why would God show mercy to someone who had spent years believing she could live without him? Those questions would follow Joyce throughout the darkest season of her life. At the time, however, she wasn't asking any of them. She was focused on building a future that looked brighter with every passing year. From the outside, Joyce appeared unstoppable. Every morning, she walked through the headquarters of her growing fashion company with confidence and purpose. Employees respected her leadership. Clients admired her professionalism. Investors saw potential. Her business had become a symbol of what determination and hard work could achieve. She had earned a reputation for excellence, and people often described her as someone who always found a way to succeed. Wherever she went, there was an atmosphere of certainty around her. She spoke with confidence. She made decisions quickly. She projected the image of someone who knew exactly where she was going. To many people, Joyce represented the modern success story. She was intelligent, driven, attractive, and financially secure. If anyone had suggested that her life would soon be turned upside down, few would have believed it. Yet appearances can be deceiving. While her professional life continued reaching new heights, another part of her life was quietly fading into the background. Years earlier, Joyce had found comfort in prayer. She had trusted God during difficult moments. She had believed that faith was essential. But success has a way of changing priorities when a person isn't careful. The busier she became, the less time she devoted to spiritual matters. Meetings replaced prayer. Deadlines replaced worship. Business goals replaced quiet moments with God. The change happened so gradually that it never felt alarming. There was no dramatic decision to walk away from faith. Instead, there was simply less room for it. The Bible that once guided her remained unopened. Church attendance became occasional. Conversations with God became increasingly rare. And because life continued going well, Joyce saw no reason to worry. That is often how these stories begin. Rarely does someone wake up one morning and decide to abandon what matters most. More often, distractions slowly take the place of devotion. Success creates comfort. Comfort creates confidence. Confidence creates independence. And independence can sometimes convince people they no longer need the very foundation that once supported them. Joyce never stopped believing God existed. She simply stopped depending on him. She trusted her abilities. She trusted her experience. She trusted her instincts. And because those things continued producing results, she felt justified in doing so. Every promotion, every contract, every financial victory seemed to confirm that she was on the right path. Yet there was something unsettling about the timing of what happened next. Years later, Joyce would look back and wonder whether the warning signs had been there all along. Had she ignored opportunities to slow down? Had she overlooked moments when God was trying to get her attention? Had she become so focused on building her empire that she failed to notice cracks forming beneath the surface? At the time, those questions never crossed her mind. She believed she was entering the best chapter of her life. Revenue was increasing. Her influence was expanding. New opportunities seemed to appear constantly. Everything pointed toward an even brighter future. What Joyce could not see was that some of the very things she depended on most were far less secure than she imagined. And within a short period of time, a series of events would begin unfolding that would challenge everything she believed about control, success, and self-reliance. The answers to those questions, the questions about what caused the fall, why everything collapsed, and whether this could have been avoided, did not begin with the financial crisis. They did not begin with the betrayal. They did not begin with the foreclosure notices or the sleepless nights. The truth reaches much further back. It begins years before the collapse, during a season when Joyce seemed to have everything. Because sometimes the most important part of a person's story is not the moment everything falls apart. Sometimes it is the period when everything appears to be going perfectly, and no one notices the danger quietly taking shape. And that is exactly where Joyce's story takes us next. Long before Joyce found herself sitting alone in that mansion surrounded by unpaid bills and uncertainty, she was a young woman with a dream. Unlike many people who inherit wealth or step into opportunities already prepared for them, Joyce started with very little beyond determination, discipline, and a willingness to work harder than almost everyone around her. Those who knew her during those early years often described her as relentless. While others were sleeping, Joyce was working. While others were spending weekends relaxing, she was researching, planning, and finding ways to move her business forward. There were countless nights when the lights in her small office remained on long after everyone else had gone home. There were moments when failure seemed possible, when money was tight, and when the future looked uncertain. Yet Joyce refused to quit. She believed that persistence could overcome almost any obstacle. That belief became one of the driving forces behind her success. In those early days, her fashion business was little more than an idea supported by determination and hope. She handled almost everything herself. She met with clients, managed operations, designed products, and spent countless hours trying to establish a reputation in a highly competitive industry. Progress came slowly at first. There were setbacks. There were disappointments. There were moments when giving up would have been easier than continuing. Yet Joyce pressed forward. Every challenge seemed to strengthen her resolve. Every obstacle became another reason to work harder. Over time, the effort began producing results. Small victories turned into larger opportunities. New clients arrived. Revenue increased. Her reputation improved. What once seemed impossible slowly became reality. People began noticing her work. Business leaders started paying attention. The company that had once struggled for recognition was becoming a serious competitor in the marketplace. As the years passed, success accelerated. Contracts became larger. Partnerships became more valuable. Investors expressed interest in supporting the company. Industry events invited Joyce to speak about entrepreneurship and leadership. Awards followed. Recognition followed. Opportunities followed. By the age of 28, she had achieved what many entrepreneurs spend their entire lives pursuing. Her fashion brand was thriving. Her income was growing rapidly. Her influence extended far beyond what she had imagined when she first started. Luxury cars replaced the modest vehicles she once drove. A magnificent mansion replaced the small spaces she once worked from. Financial security, something she had spent years striving to achieve, finally seemed permanent. Everywhere she went, people admired her story. They admired her work ethic. They admired her accomplishments. Many viewed her as living proof that dedication and persistence could transform an ordinary dream into extraordinary success. What made Joyce's rise even more impressive was that she genuinely appeared grateful in the beginning. She often spoke about how difficult the journey had been. She remembered the sacrifices. She remembered the long nights and early mornings. She remembered the uncertainty. Yet as success continued growing, something subtle began happening. The very qualities that helped her succeed were slowly being accompanied by something else. Confidence gradually became self-reliance. Self-reliance gradually became pride. Pride gradually became a belief that she was responsible for everything she had achieved. It wasn't a dramatic change. It happened so gradually that even Joyce failed to recognize it. Each success reinforced her confidence. Each accomplishment strengthened her sense of control. Each victory convinced her that she understood exactly how life worked. If she worked hard enough, she could achieve anything. If she planned carefully enough, she could avoid failure. If she stayed focused enough, she could secure her future. People around her continued celebrating her accomplishments, and Joyce continued delivering results. Yet beneath the surface, her perspective was beginning to shift. The faith that had once guided her decisions occupied less and less space in her life. Prayer became increasingly rare. Church attendance became less consistent. The Bible sitting in her home remained closed for longer periods of time. Success created a sense of independence that felt empowering. Why seek guidance when everything seemed to be working? Why slow down when every year produced greater achievements than the last? Why question the direction of her life when the results appeared so impressive? To Joyce, these changes felt harmless. In fact, she hardly noticed them at all. Her focus remained fixed on growth, expansion, and future success. Yet history is filled with stories of people who mistook prosperity for permanence. It is filled with individuals who believed their greatest victories guaranteed future security. Joyce did not realize it, But the very season she considered the strongest period of her life contained the first signs of future trouble. The warning signs were not financial. They were not visible in business reports or balance sheets. They could not be measured by revenue or market performance. They were much deeper than that. While her company continued growing stronger, another part of her life was growing weaker. While she was building an empire around herself, the foundation beneath that empire was slowly changing. And that is where the first warning signs appeared. At the time, they seemed insignificant. Years later, Joyce would recognize them as the beginning of everything that followed. Joyce grew up knowing God. Long before the luxury cars, the fashion empire, and the recognition that followed her wherever she went, faith had been a natural part of her life. She understood the value of prayer. She understood the importance of trusting God during difficult seasons. She knew the scriptures. She knew what it meant to depend on something greater than herself. During her younger years, she often believed that no matter how successful she became, her faith would always remain at the center of her life. Yet life has a way of testing the promises people make to themselves. As opportunities increased and responsibilities multiplied, Joyce gradually found herself spending less time nurturing the relationship that had once guided her. The change was not sudden. There was no dramatic moment when she decided to walk away from God. Instead, there was a series of small decisions that seemed harmless on their own, but carried enormous consequences when combined over time. The demands of success became easier to justify than the disciplines of faith. There was always another meeting to attend, another client to impress, another deadline to meet, another business goal to achieve. Joyce often told herself that her schedule was only temporary. She believed that once things settled down, she would return to the habits she had neglected. But things never settled down. The company kept growing. New opportunities continued arriving. The pace of her life became faster with every passing year. Prayer became less frequent. Days turned into weeks without meaningful conversations with God. Church became less important. Sunday mornings were often replaced by work commitments, travel plans, or much-needed rest after exhausting weeks. Her Bible remained on a shelf in her home, untouched and unopened, a quiet reminder of a relationship that was slowly fading into the background. Family members occasionally noticed the difference. Some expressed concern. Others gently encouraged her to slow down and reconnect with her faith. Joyce listened politely, but she rarely changed course. In her mind, everything was still working. The business was thriving. Her finances were strong. Her influence was expanding. The evidence seemed clear. Why worry about spiritual priorities when life was producing such remarkable results? Each achievement reinforced the idea that she was on the right path. Each success convinced her that the sacrifices were worth it. She still believed in God. She still considered herself a person of faith. Yet belief and dependence are not always the same thing. Joyce had not abandoned God entirely. She had simply stopped making room for him in the areas of life she considered most important. What made this season especially dangerous was that nothing appeared wrong from the outside. In fact, many people would have described Joyce as blessed. She was healthy. She was successful. She was respected. She was living the kind of life that countless people dreamed about. Yet prosperity can sometimes create an illusion of security. It can convince people that they are stronger than they truly are. It can create the impression that success is permanent and that control belongs entirely to those who work hard enough to obtain it. Joyce was gradually becoming comfortable with that illusion. Every accomplishment strengthened her confidence. Every victory reinforced her independence. Every year of success made it easier to trust herself and harder to recognize how much she still needed God. Then something even more subtle began happening. The gratitude that once accompanied her success started fading. In its place came a growing belief that everything she had achieved existed primarily because of her own effort. She remembered the sacrifices she had made. She remembered the sleepless nights. She remembered the risks she had taken. And because she remembered those things so clearly, she began focusing more on her role in the journey than on God's. When people praised her accomplishments, she accepted the credit. When they admired her business, she viewed it as proof of her abilities. Deep inside, a dangerous thought slowly took root. It wasn't spoken aloud very often, but it influenced the way she viewed her entire life. I built this. The words were simple, yet they carried enormous significance. They reflected a growing confidence in herself and a diminishing dependence on God. Joyce no longer viewed her success primarily as a blessing. She viewed it as evidence of what she could accomplish through determination and hard work. The more she repeated that belief, the stronger it became. And because life continued rewarding her efforts, she had no reason to question it. At least not yet. What Joyce could not see was that life was about to challenge that belief in ways she never expected. The foundation she trusted so completely would soon be tested. The wealth she relied upon would begin slipping away. The relationships she considered secure would reveal unexpected weaknesses. The future she thought she controlled would suddenly become uncertain. And when that happened, Joyce would be forced to confront a question she had spent years avoiding. Was her success truly built upon something unshakable, or had she placed her trust in things that could disappear overnight? The answer was coming sooner than she realized, and it would begin with a setback that seemed manageable at first but would ultimately change the course of her life forever. The first warning arrived unexpectedly. It did not come in the form of a dramatic disaster or a sudden collapse. In fact, when it first happened, most people around Joyce viewed it as nothing more than an unfortunate business setback. The kind of setback that successful entrepreneurs encounter from time to time. The kind of setback that experience, determination, and financial resources can usually overcome. At least that is what Joyce believed. By this point in her life, she had become accustomed to solving problems. Challenges appeared, and she found solutions. Obstacles emerged, and she worked around them. Difficult situations arose, and she pushed through them. That pattern had repeated itself so many times throughout her career that she had developed an almost unshakable confidence in her ability to recover from anything. It was a confidence that would soon be tested. The investment had seemed promising from the beginning. Advisors had spoken positively about its potential. The projections looked strong. The opportunity appeared to align perfectly with Joyce's long-term plans. After careful consideration, she committed a substantial amount of money to the venture. It wasn't a reckless decision. It wasn't based on impulse. Everything appeared calculated and reasonable. Yet business has a way of reminding people that certainty is often an illusion. What initially looked like a promising opportunity began showing signs of weakness. Small concerns emerged. Reports became less encouraging. Market conditions shifted. Then came more troubling news. Losses began accumulating faster than expected. Confidence among investors started fading. Meetings that were once optimistic became increasingly tense. At first, Joyce remained calm. She had faced challenges before. She believed this would simply become another obstacle she would eventually overcome. But as weeks passed, the situation worsened. The numbers continued moving in the wrong direction. Financial projections that once promised growth now suggested serious losses. Advisors who had once sounded confident became cautious. Investors who had once expressed enthusiasm became concerned. Then the reality became impossible to ignore. The investment collapsed. Millions of dollars vanished. Years of accumulated wealth disappeared far faster than Joyce ever thought possible. For many people, such a loss would have been devastating. It would have triggered panic, fear, and uncertainty. Yet Joyce still possessed something that prevented her from fully grasping the seriousness of the situation. She still had money. Her company remained operational. Her influence remained intact. Her reputation was still strong. She still owned her mansion. She still drove luxury vehicles. She still maintained the lifestyle that had become normal to her. While the loss was significant, it did not immediately threaten the empire she had spent years building. So she did what many successful people do when faced with unexpected setbacks. She brushed it off. She convinced herself that the loss was temporary. She reassured herself that she had enough resources to recover. She reminded herself of every previous challenge she had overcome. If anything, the experience strengthened her belief that success belonged to those who refused to quit. She worked longer hours. She focused harder on growing the business. She became even more determined to prove that she could overcome adversity through effort and persistence. To those around her, she appeared remarkably composed. Some even admired the way she handled the setback. They viewed her resilience as another example of her strength. What they did not realize was that this loss had done more than reduce her wealth. It had created the first visible crack in the foundation of certainty she had built around her life. The months that followed seemed relatively stable on the surface. Joyce continued attending meetings. Contracts were still being signed. The company still appeared successful. Employees remained optimistic. Clients continued placing orders. To an outside observer, it looked as though she had survived the storm. Yet beneath that appearance of stability, pressures were quietly increasing. Financial cushions that once felt enormous were becoming smaller. Risks that once seemed manageable were becoming more significant. For the first time in years, Joyce was beginning to experience a level of vulnerability she was not accustomed to feeling. She didn't talk about it publicly. She rarely acknowledged it privately. But somewhere deep inside, a small sense of uncertainty had begun to emerge. Even then, however, Joyce believed she was in control. She believed that hard work would solve the problem. She believed that intelligence and determination would protect her future. Most importantly, she believed that the worst had already passed. If she could survive losing millions of dollars, surely she could survive anything else that came her way. Unfortunately, life was preparing to challenge that assumption. Because the financial loss was only the beginning. What happened next would strike far closer to her heart. It would involve someone she trusted, someone she depended upon, someone she never imagined would become part of her downfall. And within months, a betrayal would change everything. The financial loss from the failed investment had been painful, but Joyce still believed she could recover. She had weathered difficult seasons before. She had overcome obstacles that would have discouraged many people. In her mind, this was simply another challenge that required patience, strategy, and determination. What she did not realize was that a far more personal crisis was already unfolding within the walls of the very company she had spent years building. Unlike market downturns and failed investments, this crisis would not come from economic conditions or business risks. It would come from a person she trusted completely. Trust is one of the most valuable assets any leader possesses. Businesses can recover from financial losses. Investments can be rebuilt. Opportunities can return. But when trust is broken by someone close to you, the damage often reaches much deeper than money. Joyce would soon learn that lesson firsthand. For years, she had relied on a business partner who seemed loyal, dependable, and committed to the success of the company. Together, they had navigated challenges, celebrated victories, and built a professional relationship that appeared strong. There was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. No obvious warning signs. No dramatic confrontations. Nothing that suggested the foundation of trust between them was quietly falling apart. The discovery happened gradually. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a minor accounting discrepancy. Certain numbers didn't align correctly. Financial reports contained inconsistencies. Transactions that should have been documented seemed difficult to trace. Employees raised questions. Accountants requested clarification. Initially, everyone assumed there was a simple explanation. Mistakes happen in every business. Records occasionally require correction. No one immediately suspected wrongdoing. Yet as investigators looked deeper, the situation became increasingly troubling. Missing funds could not be explained. Financial records contained gaps. Certain transactions appeared to lead nowhere. The more questions people asked, the fewer answers they found. Then came the moment that changed everything. The truth emerged piece by piece until it became impossible to deny. Large amounts of money had been taken from the company. The losses extended far beyond simple errors or poor bookkeeping. Someone had deliberately moved funds, concealed information, and manipulated records. As the investigation continued, all evidence pointed toward the person Joyce trusted most. The realization felt almost impossible to accept. Surely there had been a misunderstanding. Surely there was another explanation. Yet every new discovery confirmed the same painful reality. The partner she had relied upon for years had betrayed her trust. For Joyce, the financial impact was devastating, but the emotional impact was even greater. She had trusted this person. She had shared responsibilities, plans, and goals. She had believed they were working toward the same future. Now she was forced to confront the possibility that while she was focused on growing the company, someone close to her had been quietly undermining everything she had built. Before she could fully process the betrayal, another shocking development occurred. The partner disappeared. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. Meetings were canceled. Attempts to locate them produced nothing. It was as though they had vanished overnight, leaving behind confusion, unanswered questions, and significant damage. The betrayal shattered Joyce's confidence in a way the failed investment never could. Financial losses felt impersonal. This felt personal. It forced her to question her judgment. It forced her to question whether she had missed warning signs. It forced her to wonder how someone she trusted so completely could deceive her so thoroughly. For the first time in many years, certainty was replaced by doubt. The confidence that once seemed unshakable was beginning to crack. Yet even then, Joyce believed she could recover. The company was wounded, but it still existed. The damage was significant, but it wasn't fatal. At least that was what she hoped. Unfortunately, the consequences of the betrayal extended further than she initially realized. News of the company's financial difficulties began circulating among clients and business associates. Rumors spread. Questions emerged. Confidence started weakening. Some clients became cautious. Others delayed commitments. Several major accounts requested additional assurances before moving forward. Joyce worked tirelessly to stabilize the situation. She attended meetings, reassured stakeholders, and attempted to protect the reputation she had spent years building. But uncertainty has a way of spreading quickly. One client canceled a contract, then another. Soon, agreements she had counted on began disappearing. Revenue declined. New opportunities became harder to secure. As weeks passed, the atmosphere inside the company changed dramatically. Offices that were once filled with energy felt quieter. Employees became concerned about the future. Phone calls that once brought exciting opportunities now delivered difficult conversations. Some clients stopped responding entirely. Others chose competitors they believed were safer options. The momentum Joyce had worked so hard to create was slowing down. Every day seemed to bring another problem requiring immediate attention. Every week introduced a new challenge. And for the first time since building her company, Joyce could feel control slipping away. What frightened her most was that she still didn't know how far the damage would spread. The investment loss had weakened her finances. The betrayal had shaken her confidence. The departing clients were reducing revenue. Yet the full impact of these events had not yet become clear. Joyce was fighting to save her business, her reputation, and the future she had envisioned for herself. She believed that if she worked hard enough, she could still stop the collapse. But life was preparing one final blow, a moment that would force her to confront just how serious the situation had become. Because very soon, Joyce would receive a phone call that would bring her to her knees. The months following the betrayal felt like a relentless series of blows that never seemed to stop. Every time Joyce thought she had identified the problem, another challenge appeared. Every time she believed she had stabilized one area of her business, something else began falling apart. The confidence that once defined her leadership was now being tested daily. She spent countless hours meeting with advisors, reviewing financial reports, negotiating with creditors, and searching for solutions. Yet despite her efforts, the numbers continued moving in the wrong direction. The company that had once generated steady growth was now struggling to maintain stability. Revenue declined faster than expected. Expenses remained high. Existing obligations became increasingly difficult to manage. The financial cushion she once relied upon was shrinking rapidly. At first, Joyce believed the situation was temporary. She told herself that if she could survive a little longer, new opportunities would emerge. A major contract might arrive. An investor might step forward. The market might improve. She held on to those possibilities because they gave her hope. But hope became harder to maintain as reality grew more severe. Clients who had once been loyal disappeared. Some quietly moved their business elsewhere. Others openly expressed concerns about the company's future. Long-standing relationships that had taken years to build were suddenly unraveling. The trust she had spent a decade earning seemed to be evaporating in a matter of months. Debt began mounting at an alarming rate. Bills that were once easily managed started accumulating. Financial obligations became impossible to ignore. Every week introduced new demands. Every month brought additional pressure. Joyce found herself constantly trying to decide which crisis required immediate attention and which one would have to wait. Sleep became difficult. Stress followed her everywhere. Even when she was physically present in a room, her mind remained consumed by numbers, deadlines, and responsibilities. The woman who once appeared calm and composed now carried the weight of uncertainty wherever she went. What made the experience especially painful was how quickly circumstances changed. Only a short time earlier, people had celebrated her achievements. They admired her success. They wanted to learn from her. Now many of those same people were nowhere to be found. Invitations became less frequent. Phone calls slowed down. Relationships that once seemed strong suddenly felt distant. Joyce was discovering a difficult truth that many people encounter during life's hardest seasons. Success often attracts attention, but adversity reveals who is truly willing to stand beside you when everything falls apart. Then came the phone call. It arrived on a day that already felt overwhelming. Joyce had spent hours reviewing financial projections and searching for ways to keep the company afloat. She knew the situation was serious. She knew difficult decisions were approaching, yet nothing fully prepared her for what she was about to hear. When the representative from the bank explained the reality of her situation, every remaining illusion of control began disappearing. The institution that had once viewed her as a highly successful entrepreneur now viewed her through a different lens. The numbers no longer supported confidence. The financial risk had become too significant. The message was direct. If certain obligations were not met within a specified period, action would be taken. Assets could be seized. Properties could be claimed. Vehicles could be repossessed. Accounts could face restrictions. The mansion she had worked so hard to purchase was no longer secure. The luxury cars that symbolized years of success were no longer guaranteed to remain hers. The lifestyle she had spent years building was now hanging by a thread. As the conversation ended, Joyce sat in silence. For a moment, she simply stared ahead, unable to process everything she had heard. The words echoed in her mind. This wasn't another business setback. This wasn't another challenge she could solve with determination alone. This was different. This threatened everything she had built, everything she owned, everything she believed defined her success. For the first time in her life, Joyce felt powerless. That feeling terrified her. Throughout her entire journey, she had always believed there was a solution. Hard work had solved previous problems. Persistence had opened previous doors. Intelligence had helped her overcome previous obstacles. But now she found herself facing circumstances that seemed larger than her abilities. No amount of confidence could erase the debt. No amount of ambition could instantly restore lost revenue. No amount of determination could reverse the damage that had already been done. Days passed, but the pressure only intensified. Collection notices arrived. Financial demands continued. The atmosphere inside the mansion changed completely. What once felt like a symbol of achievement now felt strangely empty. Large rooms echoed with silence. Expensive furniture provided no comfort. Beautiful surroundings offered no peace. Joyce would walk through the home she had once been so proud of and feel an overwhelming sense of loss. Not because everything was already gone, but because she could feel it slipping away. The most painful part was realizing that the things she once trusted could not save her. Wealth could not give her peace. Status could not remove her fear. Success could not guarantee her future. The very things she had spent years pursuing were proving unable to provide what she needed most. And as the financial pressure continued growing, another kind of pain began emerging. It was quieter than the debt. It was deeper than the business losses. It was the realization that she was facing this battle largely alone. The crowds that once surrounded her had disappeared. The admiration that once followed her had faded. The support she expected from certain people never arrived. And that is when the loneliness became unbearable. By this point, Joyce barely recognized her own life. Just months earlier, her days had been filled with meetings, opportunities, ambitious plans, and confidence about the future. Now, every morning seemed to begin with another problem waiting to be solved, and every evening ended with questions she could not answer. The pressure had become relentless. Financial burdens weighed heavily on her mind. The uncertainty surrounding her company consumed her thoughts. Even simple moments of rest felt impossible because the fear of what might happen next followed her everywhere. The mansion that once symbolized achievement no longer felt like a reward. It felt like a reminder of everything she stood to lose. As the weeks passed, the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Joyce had spent years believing that hard work could overcome almost anything. She had built her life around determination, discipline, and personal effort. Those qualities had carried her through countless challenges. But now she was facing something different. This wasn't a problem that could be solved by staying awake longer or working harder. This wasn't a challenge that could be conquered through strategy alone. The situation had grown beyond her control, and that realization left her feeling more vulnerable than she had ever felt before. Success had left. The momentum that once pushed her forward had vanished. The confidence that once seemed unshakable was fading. The future that once appeared so clear had become clouded with uncertainty. And perhaps most painful of all, many of the people who once surrounded her were nowhere to be found. During the years of success, invitations were plentiful. Phone calls were frequent. Support seemed abundant. Yet adversity has a way of revealing which relationships are built on genuine care and which ones are built on convenience. As Joyce's circumstances worsened, many of those connections quietly disappeared. Messages went unanswered. Promises of support never materialized. Conversations became less frequent. One by one, people drifted away until the silence became impossible to ignore. For the first time in her adult life, Joyce felt truly alone. One evening, after another exhausting day filled with financial worries and difficult conversations, she found herself sitting in the vast living room of her mansion. Outside, dark clouds covered the sky. Rain tapped against the windows as the storm intensified. Inside, the atmosphere felt just as heavy. The room that once hosted celebrations and business gatherings now felt empty. The silence seemed louder than ever. On the table in front of her were stacks of unpaid bills, financial notices, and documents detailing the growing crisis surrounding her life and business. Joyce stared at them for a long time. Each piece of paper represented another problem, another burden, another reminder that the life she once considered secure was slipping away. Exhaustion settled over her like a weight she could no longer carry. Months of stress had drained her physically and emotionally. Sleep had become rare. Peace had become unfamiliar. Hope felt increasingly difficult to hold on to. For so long she had fought to maintain control, fought to find solutions, fought to preserve everything she had built. But sitting there that evening, surrounded by evidence of her struggles, she no longer had the strength to pretend everything was going to be fine. Tears filled her eyes. Not the quiet tears of temporary frustration. These were the tears of someone who had reached the end of herself. Someone who had spent years believing she could handle anything, only to discover there were battles she could not win alone. Someone who had built an entire identity around success and now found herself watching that identity crumble. Joyce sat there broken, exhausted, defeated. For a long moment, she simply stared ahead, lost in thoughts of everything she had lost and everything she feared losing next. The mansion felt empty. The future felt uncertain. The burden felt unbearable. Then something caught her attention. At first, it seemed insignificant. Just another object sitting quietly in the room. Something she had passed countless times without noticing. Yet on this particular night, her eyes settled on it and refused to look away. There, resting silently on a shelf, was a Bible. It had been there all along. Unopened, untouched, covered in dust. A forgotten reminder of a relationship she had neglected for years. For a moment, Joyce simply stared at it. Memories began flooding back. Memories of childhood prayers. Memories of church services. Memories of trusting God before success convinced her she no longer needed to. The sight of that Bible awakened something deep within her, something she had buried beneath years of ambition, achievement, and self-reliance. She couldn't explain why she suddenly felt drawn toward it. Perhaps it was because every other source of security had failed her. Perhaps it was because she had finally reached a point where her own strength was no longer enough. Or perhaps it was because, even after years of neglect, God had never stopped waiting. Whatever the reason, Joyce slowly rose from her chair and took a step toward that dusty Bible. Then another, and another. She had no idea that the decision she was about to make would alter the course of her life forever. Because what happened next was not the restoration of her finances. It was not the return of her success. It was something far more important. And it would change the direction of her life forever. For years, Joyce had trusted money. She had trusted her ability to solve problems, her talent for making decisions, and her determination to overcome obstacles. Whenever life presented a challenge, she responded with action. Whenever uncertainty appeared, she relied on strategy. Whenever difficulties emerged, she worked harder. Those habits had served her well throughout most of her life. They had helped her build a successful business, earn financial security, and create a future that many people admired. But now, sitting alone in the silence of that mansion, those same things no longer seemed enough. The wealth she once depended on could not give her peace. The success she once celebrated could not remove her fear. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly could not repair the brokenness she felt inside. As Joyce stood looking at the Bible resting on the shelf, she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. She felt conviction, not the kind that condemns a person, but the kind that reveals truth. For the first time in years, she stopped focusing on everything happening around her and began confronting what had been happening within her. The financial losses were real. The betrayal was real. The possibility of losing her mansion, her cars, and her company was real. Yet suddenly, another realization felt even more significant. Long before she began losing those things, she had already drifted away from the one who mattered most. She had spent years believing she could build her life without depending on God. She had filled her days with ambition, achievement, and personal goals while leaving less and less room for faith. Standing there in the quiet of that room, she could no longer ignore that truth. Slowly, Joyce reached for the Bible. Her hands trembled as she lifted it from the shelf. Dust covered the cover. The pages showed signs of years without use. For a moment, she simply held it against her chest. Memories flooded her mind. She remembered praying as a young girl. She remembered believing that God cared about every detail of her life. She remembered trusting Him before success convinced her she no longer needed to. The contrast between who she had once been and who she had become felt overwhelming. Tears began rolling down her face. The emotional walls she had spent years building finally gave way. There was no longer any strength left to pretend she had everything under control. Then Joyce did something she had not done in years. She fell to her knees. The successful entrepreneur, the respected businesswoman, the woman who once believed she was in complete control of her future, now knelt on the floor of her living room with tears streaming down her face. There were no cameras, no audience, no applause, no performance, just a broken heart. For several moments, she struggled to find words. The silence felt heavy, yet somehow it also felt different from the loneliness she had experienced during the previous months. This silence carried a sense of possibility. It carried the feeling that perhaps she was not as alone as she thought. Finally, through tears, Joyce whispered the words she had been carrying inside her heart. God, please forgive me. The words were simple. There was no carefully prepared speech. No attempt to sound impressive. No effort to justify her choices. Only honesty. Only humility. Only surrender. Years of pride seemed to pour out of her in that moment. She thought about all the times she had taken credit for blessings she never truly created. She thought about all the times she had ignored God's presence because life was going well. She thought about the prayers she never prayed, the opportunities to seek God that she postponed, and the confidence she placed in things that could never truly sustain her. For the first time in years, Joyce stopped trying to control everything. She stopped trying to carry every burden alone. She stopped pretending she had all the answers. And in that moment, something began to change. The financial crisis did not disappear overnight. The debts were still there. The business challenges remained. The uncertainty surrounding her future had not vanished. Yet despite all of that, Joyce experienced something she had not felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the peace that comes from having money in the bank. Not the peace that comes from receiving good news. Not the peace that depends on circumstances going your way. A deeper peace. A peace that reached beyond her situation. A peace that reminded her that even though she had wandered far from God, God had never abandoned her. As she remained on her knees, tears continuing to fall, Joyce sensed that the story of her life was changing direction. She had spent years building her identity around success. Now she was beginning to understand that true security could never be found in wealth, status, or achievement. It could only be found in the one she had neglected for so long. She did not know what the future would hold. She did not know whether her company would survive. She did not know whether her finances would recover. But for the first time since the collapse began, Joyce knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer facing the battle alone. And that realization would become the beginning of a restoration far greater than anything she could have imagined. The first miracle wasn't financial. It wasn't business. It wasn't wealth. It was peace. The kind of peace Joyce had spent years searching for in success, but never managed to find. For so long, she believed peace would come when she reached the next milestone. She believed it would arrive when the company became more profitable, when her influence expanded, when her bank account grew larger, or when her future felt completely secure. Yet every achievement only seemed to create another goal to chase. Every victory was followed by another challenge. Every success demanded more of her time, more of her attention, and more of her energy. Now, for the first time in years, Joyce discovered something unexpected. Peace was not the absence of problems. Peace was the presence of God in the middle of them. When she woke up each morning, the financial pressures had not disappeared. The debts had not magically been erased. Difficult decisions still awaited her. The uncertainty surrounding her company remained very real. Yet there was a noticeable difference in the way she faced those challenges. Fear no longer controlled every thought. Anxiety no longer followed her every step. The crushing weight she had been carrying for months began lifting little by little. Instead of starting her mornings with emails and financial reports, Joyce began starting them with prayer. Instead of ending her evenings overwhelmed by worry, she spent time reading scripture. The Bible that once gathered dust on a shelf now became a daily source of strength. And as her relationship with God grew stronger, something remarkable began happening inside her. She no longer measured her worth by the size of her company. She no longer measured her value by the amount of money she possessed. She no longer measured her future by what she could accomplish on her own. Her identity was changing. For years, she had built her life around success. Now she was building it around faith. The transformation wasn't dramatic to outside observers. There were no headlines announcing it, no awards celebrating it, no public recognition for what was taking place. But deep within Joyce, a miracle was unfolding. Her soul was healing. Her perspective was changing. Her priorities were being restored. And once that inner transformation began, unexpected opportunities started appearing. At first, they seemed like small coincidences. A former client reached out unexpectedly after months of silence. The conversation was brief, but it opened the door to future business opportunities. Then another former client contacted her. Soon after, a business associate introduced her to someone interested in investing in her company. Opportunities that had once seemed impossible suddenly became possible again. Not overnight, not all at once, but little by little, step by step, door by door. The same company that seemed destined for collapse began showing signs of life. Relationships that appeared lost were being rebuilt. Partnerships were being restored. Revenue slowly began improving. Financial burdens became more manageable. The situation was still challenging, but for the first time in a long time, Joyce could see hope on the horizon. Looking back, she would later realize that many of those opportunities arrived after she stopped making success her primary pursuit. Years earlier, she had chased wealth believing it would satisfy her. Now she was pursuing God and trusting Him with the outcome. That change made all the difference. Because Joyce eventually came to understand something many people spend their entire lives learning. Sometimes God allows us to lose our grip on temporary things so we can hold firmly to eternal ones. Sometimes the collapse of what we built ourselves creates room for God to build something far greater. And sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the restoration everyone can see. It's the restoration that happens within. Former clients returned. New investors emerged. Doors slowly reopened. The future no longer looked hopeless. Yet if you had asked Joyce what the greatest blessing was, she would not have pointed to the business opportunities. She would not have pointed to the returning income. She would not have pointed to the possibility of financial recovery. Instead, she would have pointed to the transformation that took place on the night she fell to her knees beside that dusty Bible. Because God's greatest gift wasn't restoring her business. It wasn't restoring her wealth. It wasn't restoring her reputation. God's greatest gift was restoring her soul. And that restoration would soon lead Joyce to share a powerful truth with others. A truth learned through heartbreak, loss, mercy, and grace. A truth that would move an entire congregation to tears and leave a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. A year later, Joyce stood before a congregation and shared the story she never imagined she would one day tell. The woman standing at that podium looked very different from the woman who had fallen to her knees beside a dusty Bible in an empty mansion. Outwardly, many things had improved. Her business had stabilized. New opportunities had emerged. Relationships had been restored. The future no longer seemed consumed by uncertainty. But the greatest difference wasn't visible in her finances, her career, or her circumstances. The greatest difference was in her heart. As she looked across the room filled with people listening attentively, Joyce reflected on the journey that had brought her there. She remembered the years of success. She remembered the admiration, the recognition, and the confidence that came from building a thriving fashion empire. She remembered believing that she was in control of her future. She remembered trusting her wealth, her influence, and her abilities more than she trusted God. And then she remembered the collapse. She remembered the failed investment. She remembered the betrayal. She remembered the clients who disappeared. She remembered the mounting debt. She remembered the phone call that threatened everything she had built. She remembered the loneliness. She remembered the fear. She remembered sitting alone in that mansion believing she was about to lose everything. For a moment, the room remained completely silent as Joyce gathered herself. Then she began speaking. There was a time when I believed everything I had was the result of my own strength. Her voice carried emotion. I thought my success made me secure. I thought my money made me strong. I thought my future depended on my ability to stay in control. Several people nodded as they listened. Because they understood. Many had experienced their own seasons of struggle. Many knew what it felt like to place their trust in things that eventually failed them. Joyce continued. When I started losing everything, I thought my life was falling apart. She paused briefly. But looking back now, I realized something very different was happening. The congregation listened closely. What I thought was the end was actually the beginning. Tears filled her eyes. The worst season of my life became the greatest turning point of my life. The words carried the weight of experience. Not theory, not philosophy. Experience. Because Joyce knew what it felt like to have success and still feel empty. She knew what it felt like to possess wealth and still lack peace. She knew what it felt like to build an empire while neglecting the one who gave her the ability to build it. And she knew what it felt like to encounter God's mercy when she deserved it least. For years, she had viewed the losses as punishment. Now she viewed them differently. She saw them as an invitation to return, an invitation to surrender, an invitation to rediscover the relationship she had abandoned while pursuing everything else. As she looked around the room, Joyce shared the lesson that had changed her life forever. Sometimes God allows us to lose what we're holding on to. She paused, so we can find what truly matters. The room remained still. The truth of those words settled deeply into the hearts of many listening. Because countless people spend their lives holding tightly to things that cannot last. Money, status, success, recognition, control. Yet all of those things can disappear far more quickly than anyone expects. Joyce knew that because she had lived it. She had watched the things she trusted most begin slipping away. She had discovered that wealth could not guarantee peace. Success could not guarantee security. And control was often an illusion. But she had also discovered something else. God's mercy remained. His love remained. His grace remained. Even after years of neglect. Even after pride. Even after failure. Even after believing she could live without him. God welcomed her back. Not because she earned it. Not because she deserved it. But because that is the nature of his mercy. As her testimony came to an end, Joyce smiled through tears. Not because life was perfect. Not because she would never face challenges again. But because she finally understood where true peace comes from. The congregation rose in applause, but Joyce knew the real victory had happened long before that moment. It happened on a stormy night, in an empty mansion, beside a dusty Bible, when a broken woman whispered a simple prayer and discovered that God's mercy was waiting for her all along. Looking back, Joyce realized that losing everything had brought her back to God, and God's mercy restored what pride almost destroyed. Before we close, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever gone through a difficult season that ultimately changed your life for the better? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss our future stories of faith, grace, and redemption. Because sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as our greatest struggles. And sometimes the road back to God begins when everything else falls away. God's love is greatest when we deserve it least. As Joyce's story reminds us, no matter how far we drift, no matter how many mistakes we make, and no matter how broken our situation may seem, God's mercy is always greater than our failures. What looked like the end of Joyce's story became the beginning of her greatest transformation. The loss that nearly destroyed her brought her back to the one who could restore her. And the same God who showed mercy to Joyce is still changing lives today. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced a season where God used hardship to draw you closer to Him? We would love to hear your testimony. Your story could encourage someone who is struggling right now and remind them that they are not alone. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Stories of Faith and Grace for more powerful stories of faith, redemption, hope, and God's unfailing love. And if you're already part of our community, thank you for being here and supporting this channel. Remember this: your current struggle is not the end of your story. Your setback is not your final chapter. Your pain is not proof that God has abandoned you. Sometimes God is working in ways we cannot yet see. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive through the hardest seasons. And sometimes the chapter that feels like the end is actually where a new beginning starts. No matter what you're facing today, hold on to hope. Keep praying. Keep believing. Keep trusting. Because God is never finished writing your story. Until next time, stay encouraged, stay faithful, and remember that His mercy is new every morning.